this time the stream actually starting as well. Let's see if we can. Okay, so I am live with Lauren, and we're going to be talking about the philosophy of Rene Descartes today. Lauren, do you want to just shortly introduce yourself and your relationship to the philosophy of Descartes?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lauren Slater. I'm a PhD student at Birkbeck College in London, usually when it's not closed due to coronavirus. I am writing my PhD on the philosophy of Descartes, primarily working on a kind of aspect of one of the big problems in Descartes' philosophy, the mind-body problem. So that's one of the most commonly known aspects of Descartes' philosophy, I suppose, the idea that the mind and the body are two distinct substances. And then, of course, you have the problem of how they can come to sort of interact with each other. So I work on a kind of aspect of that problem in Descartes' philosophy. Yeah, big fan of Descartes.
I mean, I was just talking to someone yesterday, and they told me, you know, we know from science that the mind is just, you know, it's just completely reducible to the brain's activity and stuff. So maybe we'll get into some of why we might be skeptical of that, and that's maybe a big theme throughout Descartes. If we were to give just a background to start things off, what's the kind of historical context philosophically and culturally at the time for Descartes?
Okay, cool. I can tell you a little bit about his life. So he was born in 1596 in a town called Le Hay, which is now called Descartes after him. So it's a very, very small town, sort of the middle of France. When he was about 10 years old, he was sent off to a slightly bigger town called La Flèche, where he studied at the Jesuit school there. So he had a Jesuit education. And he was there for quite a while. And then he took up a law degree at the University of Poitiers. His father was a magistrate and a lawyer. So I think it was sort of expected for him to go into that profession. But after that, he spent a little bit of time sort of traveling around. He enlisted in the army, actually for a brief period of time. It was only about a year. But I think most of the sort of consensus among Descartes' biographers was that he probably wasn't a sort of soldier, that he was most likely involved in sort of engineering, kind of applied mathematical stuff, and or education within the army. So it was sort of, well, it's relatively agreed upon that it's probably unlikely he was a soldier. But yes, he was out stationed in the Netherlands for a while, where he met a very influential figure for him, Isaac Beekman, who encouraged him to write his first little work called the Compendium Musicae. So it was a theory of harmony that was rooted in sort of concepts of proportion and rationality. So that was one of his first sort of writings. I think Isaac Beekman kind of inspired him to get down his thoughts on the natural sciences and so on. There's a kind of famous moment in Descartes' life where he had 3 dreams. This was in November of 1619. He had these 3 famous dreams. The first one is sort of quite a wacky sort of nightmare, that he's walking along in the streets, and there's these kind of phantoms and things like that. And he has a sort of pain in his side, and he's twirled round in a kind of whirlwind. He reaches the college where he tries to go in. He tries to pray at the chapel in the college, and he sees people he knows, and he tries to greet them, but he can't. So it's a sort of frustrating dream that I'm sure we've all had at some time or other. And then he wakes up with this sort of pain, worried that demon might be deceiving him. So that's the first sort of significant dream. Then he falls asleep again, and he has another dream where he sort of has thunder and lightning, and he wakes up to see these sort of fiery sparks, he says, which he sort of explains away. It's something that he has experienced before, so he sort of explains away the existence of these sort of fiery sparks that he sees. And then the third dream is a sort of more peaceful dream where he sees a desk with a book on it, and he goes and he realizes that the book is a kind of dictionary, or perhaps an encyclopedia of some kind, and he feels sort of content that this book is going to be useful for him. So these dreams, he recalls, are sort of significant in encouraging him to pursue his sort of knowledge of the natural sciences, primarily for him to sort of work his way through these doubts, and he sort of comes to this kind of clear position where he sort of realizes what he needs to do with his life. I think at this point, since he's been traveling around in a kind of being a bit sort of nomadic, I suppose, but he has these dreams, and he comes to realize that what he's supposed to be doing is to kind of pursue this kind of knowledge, this kind of calm that comes with this knowledge. So then he, then I suppose in a nutshell, he moves around a bit more. He goes to Paris for a while. He meets Mersenne, who's a monk who's quite significant. He has a lot of correspondence with Mersenne, a great friend throughout Descartes' life. And what else can I say? He eventually sort of settles in the Netherlands, but during this time he's already kind of writing. So in 1628 he publishes the Rules for the Direction of the Mind, which is one of his first sort of works, and that's a kind of a guide on how to sort of think well, how to think properly. It's not, I suppose it's as close as Descartes comes to a kind of logic book, although it doesn't really look like one. It's not like a formal logic at all, but rather it's this sort of practical guide, a kind of guide on how to think well, an outline of some sort of tips to kind of cultivate your mind for good thinking. Obviously his most famous work, the Meditations, published first in 1641, and then published again with a further set of replies, objections and replies, in 1642. So that, I think, was his most, it's his most well-known work, at least, the Meditations. Later in 1644, the Principles of Philosophy is published. It's also a huge one for him. I think that book was intended to be a kind of university textbook to replace some of the more sort of scholastic philosophy that was being taught in the universities. So the Principles of Philosophy kind of contains what the Meditations contains, but in a more kind of formal way. It's written as sort of articles, little articles. So it's less of a sort of journey of meditation, and it's more of a, I suppose, what Descartes would refer to as a kind of synthetic method, as a kind of laying out of the key ideas in a very simple way. So everything that's in the Meditations appears again in the Principles of Philosophy. And then of course he's summoned to tutor Queen Christina of Sweden, and he is not there for very long. He goes there in 1649. He dies the following year in 1650, in the February of 1650, and that was rumored to be because of the early mornings. She had him getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he didn't take too well to that. So that's a little nutshell of his life. I can probably say more if there's anything that you want to hear about.
I was wondering, could you touch perhaps a little bit on, like we're after the Reformation at this point, right? And the Jesuits being like a counter-Reformation movement, and scholasticism being like a big philosophical thing at the time. How do all these various things that are going on influence Descartes' thought? And I think another thing in there, I heard maybe he was quite sickly in school, so he was reading quite late on or something. Is that an influence as well? Like what are the major kind of trains of thought that are influencing his thinking, maybe culturally and stuff like that?
Okay, well, yes, certainly the kind of scholastic philosophy was very. He would have had a Jesuit education, so that's what he would have learnt. Lots of sort of Aristotelian principles and things, and actually, in his philosophy, he's quite critical of a few of the kind of key aspects of Aristotelian philosophy. In particular, some of what I work on, the account that Descartes gives of our senses, our sensation. He's quite dismissive of the kind of Aristotelian model of how the senses work. The idea that there are that the ideas, our sort of sensory ideas of colours and tastes and smells and so on, actually sort of come to us through the sensory organs, was something that he was quite critical of. So that's one thing that I personally am quite familiar with. So yes, that would have been that would have been the kind of basis of his education, and something that he sort of later came along to be quite critical of various aspects of that. In terms of why, I think, and this I suppose links to the sort of Reformation point as well, there's a kind of key idea in Descartes' philosophy, the idea that we can come to our own sort of clear knowledge of God, and clear knowledge and understanding about how the world works, how the universe sort of holds together. And I think that up until, difficult to say up until Descartes, as if he was sort of almost, definitely the first person to have ever thought of anything like this. But the sense, I suppose, was that there were authorities on things. So there were certainly sort of church authorities. And in fact, those authorities kind of governed pretty much everything, and as well as education. So what you were learning at school was also, there were things that were sort of allowed to be taught and other things that were not. So I think one of Descartes' most radical kind of impacts on that was the kind of denial of the authority of the church leaders and leaders of education, I suppose. These sort of schools that sort of had the final say on things. So his idea was that no, we could come to our own understanding. We could access these ideas sort of for ourselves and understand them clearly and distinctly, as he says, without relying on any authority. And I suppose his project is to kind of strip things back to basics, to kind of start with the simplest, most clear, most solid sort of foundations of knowledge, to strip away all the kind of silly fights that were going on, I suppose, within these schools and within, I suppose, the sort of Catholic Protestant divide, and to start off in, I think, a sort of relatively neutral place, coming to a kind of idea of God that way. And so I guess that kind of the denial of the kind of competing authorities, I suppose, was one of the impacts Descartes had, and that links to the kind of scholastic point and the Reformation point, I think.
And then I think secondly, around this time, what's referred to sometimes in like the philosophy of science is like the big paradigm shift of kind of like a mechanistic universe, and within Descartes' lifetime, just before, some things going on which are kind of shaking up how people conceive of the universe. Maybe rather than these tiers that lead up to God, this Aristotelian, everything with a telos. Maybe things are more mechanistic than we originally conceived. Maybe the Earth isn't at the center. And how is Descartes' thought shaped by some of these things that are going on?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Descartes actually started writing his 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 book, The World, his sort of treatise on the world, in when was it? I think it was 1629. He started writing, and he actually delayed its publication due to the sort of condemnation of Galileo. So this sort of the model that Galileo had, and I suppose the idea that the Earth is not the center of everything, that the Earth, in fact, moves. And I suppose that runs counter to passages in the Bible that say that the Earth is still and the Earth is fixed. The Earth can't move. And so, yes, this was a very live topic and a difficult kind of situation to navigate. And it was obviously one that Descartes was quite aware of, and indeed sort of in the thick of to some extent, although he manages somehow to kind of navigate his way through these issues. If you read the Principles of Philosophy, especially the second part, where he's talking about the world and some of the sort of more scientific, or what we would now call scientific principles, it's quite funny how he kind of skirts around these issues, because it's sort of, if you read it, it becomes relatively clear that he thought that the Earth wasn't the center of things and wasn't fixed, but he sort of cleverly disguises his thoughts there, manages to kind of escape the kind of explicit condemnation somehow, even though it's sort of, it's cheeky, I suppose, the way that he kind of gets around it. Yeah, so Descartes, I think he does have quite, in terms of the physical universe, physical bodies, he does have quite a mechanistic picture. He denies the existence of atoms, because he says that matter is sort of infinitely divisible, or infinitely divisible. So an atom, since an atom is an indivisible particle, he says an indivisible particle can't exist. So he denies the existence of atoms, but in terms of the way that the physical world hangs together, it's yes, it's bits of matter, parts of moving matter that have sizes and shapes and locations. That's how he defines physical substance. He says that the kind of principal attribute for the physical is extension. So they're extended in space, they have length, breadth, and depth. That's what he says, and they're in motion. And so he has this sort of relatively machine-like picture of the material world, at least, similar to the position of Thomas Hobbes, who they were alive at the same time. Hobbes was significantly older than Descartes, but they had a little correspondence during his life. But yeah, Hobbes was a materialist. He thought that the material comprised everything, and had this sort of very mechanistic picture, machine-like picture of the world. Except for Descartes, the big difference is, I suppose, that there's this kind of spiritual substance on top. So yeah, that's the difference. But yeah, he did have a quite this sort of yes, certainly a kind of mechanistic picture of the world as it hung together. And yeah, bets are on as to his views on whether or not the Earth was fixed. But I think it's pretty safe to think that he didn't think that the Earth was fixed, and that yeah, he did have a kind of model whereby we were going around the sun. Yeah.
Awesome. So if we move on then to the Meditations, which is maybe the major kind of piece that people know Descartes for. First of all, what's his kind of motivations in writing the Meditations? Is there some kind of reason, or I think I've heard Noam Chomsky say he wanted the Jesuits to take his philosophy seriously or something. Is that the case, or like what's kind of going on?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to speculate. I think it's hard to speculate about Descartes' motivations, just because he has his finger in quite a lot of pies. He doesn't. It's he wrote a great deal. There are a great deal of works to consider when you think of his sort of philosophical corpus, and they all are concerned with sort of different things. So it's hard to sort of speculate as to what exactly his sort of key motivations were. I think he was a very curious person, and that's the sort of impression that you get. He sort of is seeking a kind of knowledge and understanding of how things work and how things go together, a kind of understanding of the universe as it is, and of God and minds and everything else. I suppose we've got in the Meditations, we have the dedicatory letter to the Sorbonne at the beginning, sort of prefacing the whole thing, and there we have a kind of relatively explicit sort of reason as to why the Meditations are why he wrote the Meditations, and one of those is to give a rational proof for the existence of God, and also to explain the distinction between the soul and the body. So we have those as kind of explicit kind of reasons as to why Descartes wrote the Meditations. So we have those explicit. I think we can speculate as to whether or not his motivations are religious. I think there's no denying, really, I don't think in any serious way, denying that Descartes believed in God. God is a huge part of his philosophy. His philosophical system just doesn't work at all without having God in it. But he seems, to me, sort of slightly less concerned with issues regarding God on a kind of
theological sort of basis.
Yeah. And I suppose he's not, he doesn't seem to be seeking so much the truth about, how to lead a good life. Well, I suppose, there's sort of concerns a little bit about these sorts of things, but it does seem to be more about presenting a kind of picture of the world and how it works. It's a kind of picking apart and a kind of understanding in a relatively sort of what we might now call a sort of scientific way. I mean, obviously he has to justify himself to various church officials and so on. But there's, there may be a sense, and I think, some people certainly think this, that there's a sort of sense in which he's saying what he needs to say, rather than, saying what he truly believes or thinks about why he's engaging in writing the Meditations. So perhaps that gives us reason to be a little bit skeptical about what he explicitly says at the beginning in that letter. But then there are also there's religious significance to be found in a lot of his works, and even in the Meditations, for example, that it's written in 6 parts. So that was a sort of traditional form where you'd read one per day and then rest on the 7th, which obviously has huge religious significance. So that it's certainly not that his religion was not significant to him at all, but there is a sense in which he's sort of like, well, let me get on with my science. Yeah.
So one of the first kind of major themes in there in the Meditations is this sort of idea of skepticism, what might be called like a famous sort of 3 waves of doubt that come along. Why is Descartes kind of employing this doubt, and what are these kind of 3 waves? Where do they lead us?
Okay, yeah, great. So we start off in the first meditation with this big sort of plummet into nothingness, or yes, as he describes it, as a whirlpool. So we get sort of sucked down. Yeah, it describes these three, as you say, three waves of doubt, three stages of doubt. The first one is a relatively sort of straightforward doubting of the senses. So you might think of examples like putting a stick in a glass of water. The stick looks bent, but of course we know that it's not. That's a kind of trick of the eye. So we can doubt sort of things that come in through the senses as whether or not they're actually sort of presenting the truth about things that they things actually are. Second, we have the kind of dreaming doubt. So that's a sort of further stage where you know, there may not be a glass of water or a stick at all, but you might still experience it as if there were these things. So that's the sort of second, slightly more worrying stage of doubt. And then we have the third stage, which is the sort of evil demon, evil genie, deceiving stage, where Descartes posits the idea that there might be a demon who's deceiving us about just about everything. So even seemingly certain mathematical truths might be wrong, might be fallacious. So every time we go to add up 1 and 2, we might sort of be making a mistake when we get 3. So this is obviously this is sort of the most devastating stage of doubt, where we can't even be certain about things that seem incredibly certain to us, like the truths of mathematics. So that's where we get to, and we're left there at the end of the first meditation in this stage of thinking that, you know, well, nothing exists at all, nothing's real, we can't know the truth about anything. Then we get to the second meditation, and we have the famous cogito argument, where you know, the famous quote, the "I think, therefore I am." So we have Descartes reasoning that all the while he's doubting. So even in the very sort of final stage of the doubt, even if there is an evil demon deceiving us and making us doubt even, you know, things that seem evidently certain to us, even at that stage, there has to be something, some sort of subject to doubt. So to be doing the doubting, there's doubting that exists, and he's sort of reasons that doubting is a kind of species of thought. So there's still thinking, there's something doing the thinking, something doing the doubting. That's where he comes to the kind of first solid principle. He hits the ground, if you like. He hits the sort of foundation, and he comes up with the, well, all the while there's thinking, you know, there's something that exists, the thinking thing. And at that stage, that's all we really can know. So we just know that there's a thinking thing, a reason, an intellect, he says, just a thinking thing. So that's the kind of solid point at which he sort of hits there.
So some people on that point, you know, what would say, oh well, it's, you know, it's circular in some sense, or, you know, what's an eye to where's this concept coming from? Should we be skeptical of that? It commits a man fallacy or something. What do you think? Some of these critiques that people seem to raise today, are they kind of actually addressed in there in the text itself, and people just aren't exegeting them, do you think?
Yeah, so, well, I suppose if they're not addressed, or at least some of the kind of concerns of the cogito argument, if they're not addressed in the second meditation, where we have the kind of leading through of these ideas, there are some that come up in the objections and replies. So this was a little set of objections that were sent from various authors, some of them various authors, that were published alongside the meditations. So the meditations were sort of sent around to various other intellectual people of the community at the time, and they sent Descartes objections, and he replies to those objections, and then those little objections and replies are published alongside at the end of the meditations. So what can I say? We we have this objection still now, and again does feature as well in the objections and replies, that how do we know that the sort of thinking thing can't be something physical? So I suppose this is the cogito is Descartes' proof for the existence of a mind, and I suppose one of his arguments for the separation of the mind and the body that we see is that, well, I can doubt the existence of my body. I can doubt that I have my hands in front of me, but I can't doubt that I'm doubting. I can't doubt that there's thought there. And so if you can doubt one but not the other, that must mean that they're two distinct substances, or two distinct things. So that's one sort of key objection. I suppose, what can I say about that? As far as Descartes sees it, he sees, this sort of piece of very certain knowledge as a kind of clear and distinct piece of knowledge, and that's something that perhaps you want to ask about.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's quite.
Well, you've mentioned that already, I suppose. Do you want to outline, because it's not just necessarily this is in some sort of syllogism that leads to the conclusion or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you were saying about the kind of logic and reasoning book as well for Descartes. Mm-hmm. If it's like, how do we see things clearly and distinctly? Well, what does that mean? It's not like a formal language or anything.
Yeah. So no, this is great, and I think this is this is a good sort of very key part, an underlying part of Descartes' philosophy. So it's good to talk about it. So Descartes was quite sort of critical of things like syllogisms, and the reason for that, I suppose, is that if you've got a syllogism like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, so we've got a classic syllogism. Descartes says that if you know what you're putting in there, then you already know the conclusion. You're not learning anything new. So syllogistic logic like that, when it's formalized in that way, it's not going to give you any kind of new knowledge. You're sort of putting into a form things that you already know about. Okay, so his method, his sort of way of describing how we should think well, is much more. It's based on these kind of intuitions, I suppose, like intellectual intuitions. I don't know if, yes, perhaps this isn't. This is still quite a sort of slippery notion. So we'll try and sort of make it as clear as possible. He talks about the natural light. So he talks about things being revealed by the natural light. Natural light goes hand in hand with this kind of idea of clear and distinct perceptions for Descartes. So it's worth sort of getting clear on what these things mean. So he does give some definitions of what he means by clear and distinct perception. So he said perception is clear where it's sort of present to the attending mind. So it's sort of very immediate, sort of transparent, right there to sort of see. And then it's a perception is distinct when it's so sort of sharply separated from other perceptions that it contains within it only what is clear, so only what's kind of immediately present to us. So perhaps it's best to think about this in relation to some examples. So when we have a clear and distinct perception, mathematical examples are always good here, simple ones. So when we have a kind of clear and distinct perception of a triangle, say, we understand the triangle, we understand it as separated from everything else. We can sort of see, we can be thinking of only a triangle, and we can understand the triangle in as much as it's it's three lines, it's three angles, it's a shape, bound just like that. And we can't help but kind of assent to various truths, thinks Descartes. So we can't help but understand that, well, there are three sides, so there must be three angles. That's just something that is so evident, it's so kind of immediate to us, that we just can't help but assent to it. We can't help but judge it to be true. That if the triangle has three sides, and it also has three angles. So contrast that with perhaps a sensory perception, like judging that some particular object is a certain color. Well, it might seem to you sort of clear in some way, or evident in some way, that some particular object is some particular color, but we can imagine it to be otherwise. So we can imagine, oh, perhaps unknowingly to us, someone had a kind of light filter over the bulb, and it's not actually red. It was just the light filter that was making it look red, or something like that. We can imagine it to be otherwise, but with our clear and distinct perceptions, we can't imagine them to be otherwise. So we can't help but just know them to be true. So he's relying on this idea that we have this sort of intellectual experience. It's kind of like an aha or a eureka moment, where we're in this natural light. We're just like, oh, it's like it's like the light comes on, and we just realize, and we just know it to be true when we have these sort of clear and distinct perceptions. So it works. His description of how to think well is really, in the rules of the direction of the mind, is how to sort of move from these clear and distinct perceptions to other ones, how to kind of reflect on our ideas, to get them down to their kind of simplest forms, and to reflect on what is evidently clear and what is completely distinct, and that's the way we should sort of proceed. So it works on this sort of intuitive way, rather than these sort of formal rules, like you might get in other logic textbooks.
I do have a question on that. I'm just going to turn my light on from dark. I'll be 1 second.
Yeah, of course. That's great. I can see you now.
There you go. So I suppose then, does Descartes talk about at all like disagreement between people? So say if two people had like different clear and distinct, what they thought were clear and distinct perception, how would they kind of decide which one's right? Or is that kind of touched on at all anywhere?
I can't think of anything that, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that Descartes says on that particular issue. I suppose he would think it would be impossible. So if I would, I mean, again, this is sort of a very simple example, so it's clear to sort of see it, but if I were thinking of a triangle and you said you were thinking of a triangle, but you said that triangles have four angles or something, then we would know that something had gone wrong with your reasoning, or with your, you weren't exactly having a clear and distinct perception in that case. So yeah, but I can't think of anything that he says explicitly on that.
Sure. Yeah, no, but it's because in a few conversations recently, I've used some of these examples talking to people. So I've said, I've used the triangle example. It's like, okay, with triangles, but then with things like moral facts, I'd say, well, it's wrong always and everywhere to kill babies or something like that. And then I'll be like, can't you see that as clearly and distinctly as you see, a triangle with three sides always and everywhere, sort of thing? Maybe it's but I don't want to go too far off track with that one. So then we've come kind of to the bedrock, the cogito. How does Descartes go about then building things back up from there?
Okay, good. So in the third meditation, after the cogito argument, we get his first proof for the existence of God. So this is a big one, because we kind of need God to get back up to the top again. We want to get rid of any trace of the idea of an evil demon who might be deceiving us. We need God to sort of preserve the truth enough for us to get out and get the existence of the external world sort of back again. So In the third meditation, we have Descartes' argument, sometimes the trademark argument for the existence of God. So he begins that meditation by thinking about our ideas. So this bit gets a little bit tricky. There's some bits in the third meditation that people really like to argue about. So we'll tread as carefully as we can. But he splits his ideas up tentatively into three categories. So we have innate ideas, which are ideas that are kind of inbuilt, that don't come to us through the senses. People disagree about what innate might mean. Some people think it might mean, that they're with us from birth or something like that. But I suppose the key thing here is just to know that they're ideas that are not sort of coming to us through any sensation. They're things like our mathematical ideas, and as we will see, our idea of God. So our sort of innate ideas we have, and then we have the second category, which Descartes calls adventitious ideas. And these are ideas that come to us through the senses, or at least this is what he's sort of positing at the moment. So ideas of sounds and colours and tastes and smells and things that are coming to us from outside. And then the third category is ideas that are invented. So he says ideas invented by me, things like unicorns and stuff like that. Ideas that you put together yourself, that you compose yourself out of other bits and bobs. So having done that, he reflects on some of his ideas. And well, in between whiles, he has a whole thing about the distinction between formal reality and objective reality. So the easiest way to explain, I suppose, is our ideas have objective reality for Descartes, which sort of means that they represent, they have objects, they represent things. So my idea of the sun has as its object the sun. The sun exists sort of objectively in my idea. It has objective reality in as much as it's my idea, but it has formal reality in as much as it exists outside of me, outside of my mind. So that's the kind of distinction that we have of formal reality and objective reality. Now, Descartes says of our ideas that in order to, well, our ideas have to be created by something with at least as much formal reality as they have objective reality. So take the sun example again, since this is, perhaps a sort of simplification because the sun's a kind of slightly complicated example for Descartes, but we have the sun existing formally, and then we have the idea of the sun as it exists objectively in my mind. And since the sun has sort of the formal reality, it means that my idea can kind of have its objective reality in virtue of the fact. So yes, perhaps at this stage we're sort of tentatively suggesting that, well, maybe we have this idea because we can see the sun, feel the sun, so on. So it sort of has its reality in that way. So then Descartes comes to consider his idea of God, right? So he says that he has an idea of God. That is an idea of a kind of infinitely great being with all of these sort of perfect attributes. Now he says this idea couldn't have been invented by him because it has more reality than he himself does, right? So he says this idea is sort of more perfect, it contains more reality, it sort of lacks nothing, right? While he considers himself to be lacking in some respects. So in that sense, the idea has more reality since it's not lacking in anything, in any respect, than he himself does. And so he deduces that he can't be the author of his idea. He can't he can't have made that idea because it's more than he is, right? And something that's more can't come from something less. That's one of his sort of causal principles that he sort of tentatively outlines in the third meditation, that if, you know, something that's greater can't come from something that's lesser. There has to be a degree of similarity between the cause and the effect. So he can't be the cause of his idea of God. And in fact, nothing can except for God himself. So we have this idea of God, and that must mean that God must exist formally, that is outside of our mind. And the God existing in formal reality must be what gives us this idea, gives us God sort of as he exists objectively in our intellects. So that, in a nutshell, I suppose, is his first argument. So it relies on this funny little distinction that Descartes has between objective reality and formal reality. A subject of much debate in sort of Descartes scholarship and early modern scholarship more generally, because can be a bit of a sort of tricky, confusing thing, and he says some things about it that are hard to grasp, I think.
Yeah, so someone in the chat has said, is it kind of like if you can imagine it, then it's real? And I'm wondering, you know, how would Descartes try and explain that part of his idea, the kind of causal adequacy principle sort of thing?
Right. Yeah. So I guess with our invented ideas, you know, in as much as, well, if you can imagine it, then it must sort of in some way have this formal reality. Well, of course, Descartes wouldn't want to say that, well, because I can imagine a unicorn, then the unicorn sort of must exist or something like that. That's not what Descartes wants to allow with this kind of proof for the existence of God, of course. So again, we are relying on the notion of a clear and distinct perception. So our idea of God for Descartes is a clear and distinct one. That is, you know, it's immediately present to us and it's sharply separated out from all of our other ideas. And that's contra to something like my idea of a unicorn in a significant respect. So my idea of a unicorn is a kind of composed idea, right? I'm the author of its parts. Perhaps I have this idea of a horn and I have this idea of a horse. And I sort of smush them together somehow in my imagination. So that's not what we're doing in the case of our idea of God. Our idea of God is innate, he thinks. So it's you know, it's not coming to us through sort of the sensation, and it's not something that we've composed. We haven't made up our idea of God. We've simply sort of discovered it. So Descartes' idea is that it's sort of revealed to us, or at least, you know, once we reflect on these ideas, once we reflect on kind of what's in our intellect, what must be true, we come across it. So the idea of God is not one that's made up by us, but rather we kind of discover it within our own minds. At least that's how it's for Descartes. I should also say that there's a distinction for Descartes between the imagination and the intellect. So these are sort of different faculties within our minds. The intellect is, you know, responsible for grasping these kinds of truths. The imagination works with, sort of images and things. So, of course, we don't. Well, perhaps you might imagine an image when you think of God, but perhaps, you know, we have a kind of understanding of God that's not necessarily tied to any particular image. So there's a distinction there as well, that our idea of God is something we access, something we discover through our intellectual reflection rather than imagination.
And so then the second proof, I suppose, for God's existence, Descartes' version of the ontological argument, as it's sort of referred to, and maybe if we talk about, you know, what is the essence of a thing, and can essence involve existence?
Okay, so yeah, the ontological argument that Descartes gives, I suppose, is I mean, he says it's different to Anselm's ontological argument. I don't see a huge difference. I suppose that what Descartes says explicitly about it is that Anselm's ontological argument relies on the kind of meaning of the word God, rather than, and he says, no, I'm not talking about the meaning of any word, I'm talking about this idea that we have, right? We have this idea of God, this clear and distinct idea, and we reflect on that idea. We realize that existence sort of pertains to it, that existence must necessarily be part of it. I'm not talking about the meaning of any word. Although I suppose, and again, this is a topic that comes up quite a lot in my research, Descartes' philosophy of language, not that he says all that much about words and their meanings, but he does say some things which I think are quite revealing. I think Descartes must think that ideas are like the meanings of words. So if we're using the word God, the meaning of that word is what's in our mind when we're using it, or at least that's what I think Descartes must have sort of thought. So to that extent, if Anselm's talking about the meaning of the word God and Descartes talking about the idea God that we have, I don't know that they're really talking about two different things. I suppose Descartes would accept that the meaning of the word God is our idea of God. But one difference, I suppose, is that, well, for Descartes, the idea of God that we have, as I say, is discovered, right? It's not, we don't decide what the word God means. We don't decide what our idea of God is. We discover it. It's revealed to us. We think and we reflect, and then we sort of discover, oh, okay, God. God, I have this idea of this perfect, infinitely perfect being. And so in that sense, as we know, I guess against Anselm's argument, we have the Galeno objection, the perfect island objection. So, well, it just works the same. I've got this perfect island and it's perfect in every way. And so perfect island must exist, because a perfect island that exists is more perfect than one that doesn't exist. So you can sort of prove the existence of anything. Well, I suppose, and it sort of goes back to the question that was asked, we can't have that with the idea of God for Descartes, because we don't have, we're not putting in the ingredients into our idea of God. We're not building our idea of God or deciding that he's, this perfect being and so he must exist. Rather, we just reflect on something that exists, in some way. It exists for us to discover rather than for us to invent. And so if we can reflect on our own minds and our own ideas, and we probably won't, or at least we won't find an idea of a perfect island that exists in the same way. We won't have a clear and distinct perception of a perfect island, so it's not going to work. That objection is not going to kind of play against Descartes' version of the ontological argument. So I think for Descartes, it's about this process of intellectual reflection, about thinking on your idea and deciding. I like to think of it as sort of a zooming in, that you kind of zoom in and you see, you kind of get closer and closer and you see, oh, look, there's existence pertains to the essence. Oh, look, there's infinite goodness. Oh, look, there's omnipotence, whatever. And you start to see that these things must pertain to the very nature of God once you kind of intellectually reflect on that idea. And so that I think is in effect his argument. He sort of says, well, look at your idea and you'll realize that existence is there as part of that idea of God.
I find what sticks with me always is, you'll find something along the line, I'm paraphrasing, existence can't be separated from it in the same way a valley can't be separated from the peak of a mountain, which I quite kind of like.
Yeah. Yeah, and also again with the sort of mathematical examples, it's the same sort of thing. So if we reflect on our idea of a triangle, we'll realize, well, it absolutely has to have three angles. In the same way, you know, you reflect on your idea of God and you realize he absolutely has to exist. It's sort of necessary that he exists. So that's how it's supposed to work. Yeah.
So I thought from here it might be good, especially pertaining to some of this stuff that you're doing in your research as well, to ask you about Descartes' arguments for the soul. So perhaps if we divide it into, I'm not sure in which order you'd want to do these, but like argument for like the indivisibility of the soul, and an argument for like the mind-body distinction. Is it from like conceivability? With that, I'm not sure if that's even the best way of. Sometimes I say these things and it turns out that I've got a take on philosophers from reading like other people's interpretations, and then I just read that into them and it's not quite there. But yeah,
sure. Okay, yeah, we can talk about soul and soul body distinction. So one thing to note, I suppose, at the outset is that Descartes kind of uses mind and soul pretty interchangeably. So the thinking thing, that's the soul or the mind. So whichever you'd prefer. So the soul is immaterial, it's not physical, so it doesn't have a shape, size, location, anything like that. It's comprised of pure thought, so it's thinking, and that's what it is. I've quite recently been teaching A-level philosophy to a class of sixth form students, and it's a hard thing, I suppose, today especially, and it became sort of very clear to me in speaking to these teenagers about these issues, that the idea that the mind is the brain is so solidified in people now, in quite a striking way, that, you know, the idea that the mind was something non-physical was to them quite bizarre. It was something that was difficult to grasp, whereas to me, I suppose, it sort of seems intuitive. I guess I grew up in a religious household, so I suppose it's this idea of a kind of soul, something that lives on beyond the body, or something that is in some way sort of separate from the body, seems to me quite intuitive. But I know it's not for everyone, and especially today, where science sort of dominates everything. But I can say, so let's talk about conceivability argument and divisibility arguments. So the divisibility argument goes that the body is divisible. So in virtue of body being extended substance, that is having, you know, shape, size, length, breadth, and depth, it can be cut up. So the body is, not that I'm recommending that you do this, the body is divisible. It can be sort of cut up an indefinite amount of times, since, you know, there can always be a smaller bit. So that's a property that the body has, but the mind does not. So Descartes thinks that the mind is sort of in a significant way indivisible, that our experience is sort of whole, right? We don't have, well, I suppose he thinks, you know, you can't cut up your thoughts, or at least that's something that seems like bizarre, something that doesn't quite make sense, doesn't quite compute. It doesn't, since a thought is not extended, there's no, it's not in space, so it's not something that can be divided up. That's one of his arguments for, or one of his sort of thoughts about, that motivates the idea that the soul and the body are distinct. But I suppose it boils down to these two very, he's got these two clear and distinct perceptions. Well, eventually he gets this perception of extended substance. So this clear and distinct idea of extended physical substance, and this clear and distinct idea of mental substance, mind. And they're complete, they're whole. They don't, obviously, since they're distinct, as we learned earlier, they don't bleed into each other at all, right? They're sharply separated, and they could be kind of complete ideas, complete perceptions, without relying on each other. It's not the case that one contains the other or vice versa. They're entirely separate, and they have distinct attributes, distinct properties and attributes. So this is what's sort of at the basis of all of these arguments. I suppose that is, in essence, the conceivability argument, right? That we can conceive of the mind as entirely distinct from the body, and we can conceive of the body as entirely distinct from the mind. And indeed, these are the conceptions that we have. And so they, since we can conceive of it like that, and since God is no deceiver, since God is not deceiving us about our clear and distinct perceptions, then we have to conclude, well, they are really distinct. There's a real distinction there. So I I know that this is perhaps, it's quite an unattractive view these days, and I know that actually for a lot of people, especially for a lot of philosophy students, the first introduction, the first time that they meet Descartes, they'll get some sort of rough and ready version of his dualism, perhaps most likely in a philosophy of mind class or something like that. And then you instantly have this sort of interaction problem, the idea put to him by one of his interlocutors, one of his corresponders, Princess Elizabeth. So he had a pretty lengthy correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, and she put this problem to him. She said to him, look, I just can't understand how an immaterial, ghost soul mind, I can't understand how a substance like that could have effects, be causally efficacious, have effects on the body, and vice versa. I can't understand how the two substances interact. If they do, if they're really distinct, and if they share no characteristics, then how is it that when I think to raise my hand raises? How is it that I have these various motions in my sensory organs, and that generates particular ideas in my mind? How is it that these two substances are sort of together in this human being? So I can talk about his response to Elizabeth. So his response to her is to say that, well, he then separates out different kinds of knowing, so different kinds of knowing or understanding. So he says, when we're thinking with our kind of philosophy hat on, when we're thinking in this sort of robust philosophical way, this sort of robust scientific way, where we're trying to get to the truth about the sort of hard truths about our reality, and we're relying on our clear and distinct perceptions when we're doing our kind of robust thinking, then of course, we have these clear and distinct perceptions of body and of mind, and we understand them to be distinct. But in our kind of everyday conversations, in our ordinary ways of speaking to each other, and in our ordinary sort of the way that we usually navigate the world, and that is extremely reliant upon the senses, he says, well, look, you understand the mind-body union just fine because you sense it, you feel that they're connected. That's effectively his answer. He says, look, when we're just sort of thinking and speaking and sensing in the world normally, then it's just something that's evident to you. It's just something that's completely evident that these two substances interact. And whilst it might be sort of a mystery as to how it is that these two substances interact, nevertheless, you can know that it's happening because you know in this other kind of way, in this sort of ordinary language type way, this everyday, well, your senses are telling you, you stub your toe on a chair and it hurts. Well, that pain is telling you that your mind and your body are intimately linked together. So yeah, I mean, many people find his answer extremely unsatisfying because I suppose she's asking about how this is happening, how the mind and the body are interacting, and his answer, I suppose, is not really to tell her how, but to tell her, well, you know, you just have to understand it differently, and you'll just sort of accept it to be true. But I think his answer gets a sort of a really bad a bad rap when maybe it shouldn't get quite such a bad rap. And I do think that the key to understanding that is in the way that he separates out these kinds of knowledge, these kinds of knowing. So in one of his works, the comments on a certain broadsheet, as it's called, this was a reply with some comments to a guy called Regius, who at one time was a kind of follower and friend of Descartes, and then they fell out. They fell out because Regius published a broadsheet which was quite critical of some of Descartes' ideas. And so Descartes wrote back. He wrote back this little sheet of comments dealing with the things that Regius had said. And in that work, in the comments, Descartes says he sort of has this little breakdown of kinds of knowledge. One is this sort of philosophical knowledge, this sort of, you know, robust, clear and distinct perceptions, this sort of zone, intellectual. Then we have our kind of sensory knowledge, and this is the knowledge that we sort of rely upon, right? It's the mode we're usually in when we're not sitting at home meditating and working our way through Descartes' principles. We're just out in the world and we're not bumping into things because we're using our eyes and we're using our you know, all of our senses to move around. Okay, and we're sort of relying on that kind of knowledge. It's just a different kind of knowledge for Descartes. It's not going to give us clear and distinct perceptions. It's not going to tell us about the true nature of the world that we're in, but it's going to give us something helpful about the way in which we interact with, you know, with the world, with the sort of physical world that we're in. It's going to keep us safe, right? He says that the purpose of the senses is for God to kind of keep our bodies out of trouble, effectively. It's to tell us about the sort of helpfulness or harmfulness of anything. So that's the second kind. And then the third kind is sort of religious knowledge, right? And these are sort of matters of faith. Matters of faith that we can't clearly and distinctly understand. So things like the doctrine of the Trinity, which is hard to understand, right? It's near impossible to grasp it. Well, it is sort of impossible to grasp it. It's sort of in some way kind of almost illogical or something. It's very hard to understand it, but nevertheless, it's something that we ought to accept. So it's something that we ought to accept as a matter of faith rather than fitting into either of the other two categories. And so I think this is important because it means that his answer to Elizabeth is effectively like, look, you're trying to understand the mind-body union as a sort of piece of philosophical knowledge. You're trying to understand the human being, the union of the mind and the body together. You're trying to understand that as a piece of philosophy, as something that you can grasp clearly and distinctly, but you can't. It's just not the kind of thing that you can know like that. Rather, it's the kind of thing that you just experience. You experience that the mind and the body are united, and that's because, you know, you experience this intimate connection between, you know, what you sense, the ideas that arise, and what you think, and then, you know, the actions that follow in your physical body. And so that is his answer. He's sort of saying, look, you're going about it the wrong way. You're kind of thinking about it too hard. Don't think about it so hard. Maybe it's still unsatisfying, but I think understanding that about his philosophy maybe makes it slightly more appealing.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that.
Yeah, no worries.
So I've got some questions from the chat to go through, and also you might want, because you've been talking for a while, I'm wary that, you know, so sometimes I've hit a point before where I've been talking and like my throat's gone dry and I know what everything's gone crazy. So one question someone's asked is, are there any notable Cartesian as in anti-Aristotelian Catholics? And I guess I don't know if you mean specifically from this period or just in general.
Yeah, well, so quite a few, I suppose. Let me think of. Well, I guess Arnaud, Antoine Arnaud, and Pierre Nicole, who wrote the what's known as the Port Royal logic, logic or the art of thinking. It's called. It's a logic book. What they were trying to do was give Descartes a logic, a kind of more formal, slightly more formal logic, perhaps that they thought his philosophy was maybe missing. I believe they were Catholic. They were certainly Cartesians. And I suppose his philosophy kind of appealed. There was definitely a kind of Catholic Cartesian or a formulation, Catholic formulation of Cartesian philosophy, and also a Protestant formulation of Cartesian philosophy at the time. I mean, he created a big stir. You know, he was extremely influential, and by the time he died, he was really quite famous. So there were a lot of followers on both sort of sides, both Catholic and Protestant sides. So yes, in answer to that question.
So then someone's trying to describe the Trinity in the chat, but they've described modalism and fallen into heresy. So another question: could the apparent correlations of various things that are apparently experiences, could the apparent correlations of various things that are apparently experiences in thought just be a series of coincidental collisions of raw experience data, and the cogito fail in that way? I guess this is kind of Humean, like, are we confusing similarity with identity in some sense? How do you think Descartes would answer those, or personal opinion, I suppose, as well?
Okay, so I think I'm slightly confused at the question. Is it the idea that sorry, yeah, can you repeat?
Yeah. So I think what it's saying is we've got this sense data coming in that we've just kind of correlated in a particular way and sort of deluded ourselves into thinking that there is an I, that there is some thing that I am.
Right.
That's a thinking thing.
Okay. I suppose. So the idea is that, you know, it could just be that there's all these experiences and there's nothing to sort of bind them together.
Yeah, there's actually no I. It's just kind of a delusion of sort that we're in when we think we're a thinking thing. So I
right.
think yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there is, I was trying to think earlier of the name of this. There was a paper I was thinking of that was about the kind of Cartesian I, as to whether or not it does sort of count as a kind of self, or, you know, Descartes' conception of the self. I can't actually remember it now, so that's unhelpful. But I guess the way that I understood the cogito, and still I suppose sort of understand it now, is that the cogito argument kind of relies on the fact that there is thinking, right? So even if you sort of take away the I, you've got the existence of thinking, right? And perhaps for Descartes, you know, the thinking substance is just thinking. So to a certain extent, yes, you know, there's sort of something that thinks, but that something is just sort of comprised of thinking. So I suppose Descartes he wants to say that our sort of conscious experience is unified in some way. There's something that seems to persist, you know, it seems to be the same I that was talking, you know, however long ago now. Oops. The same I that was, you know, talking 20 minutes ago, and the same I that's speaking now. There's sort of something that seems clear to us, that there's something unifying those two events in some way, that it's the same thing. But I think in terms of what you need for the cogito argument to work, where you just need thinking. So the sort of I, maybe you could reformulate it, I suppose, to sort of leave out too much baggage about what exactly the self is. Maybe that's fair.
The person who's saying, just to reply in the chat, someone said, how is that the modalist heresy? It's because the analogy that you've used is it would be God being one person who has three different faces, and this was like an early Christian kind of thing where it was like, no, it's three persons. I check out William Lane Craig stuff just to not go off. So someone along similar lines, someone has said, what if I'm not a thinking thing, just a thing that remembers thinking, like a playback device that has no personal memory? And maybe you've kind of touched on that in your previous answer, but is there anything else that kind of raises?
No, I guess, there'd have to be, for the cogito to work, it's just, there's something to be, well, there's doubting, there's thinking, there's something doing the doubting, there's something doing the thinking. There's that going on. And so I suppose it has to be, if you're following through that argument, if you're taking the journey along with Descartes, down through the whirlpool of doubt and out the other side again, then it doesn't, I suppose it doesn't really work if the thinking isn't going on at that moment. Yeah.
And so someone's asked, like, if we invented a sentient AI, would that challenge Descartes' view of the mind? So would that be like almost like a counter, an example that's runs counter to what Descartes is putting forward?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is a great sort of issue to think about from a kind of Cartesian perspective. I think it gets in a little bit. Well, I won't get into now because I know that we've been chatting for a while. But Descartes' views on animals. So a lot of people think that he sort of gave animals a hard time. That he sort of thinks, well, animals don't have minds, which is true. To a certain extent, he doesn't think that animals are sort of mind-body unions in the same way that human beings are. But nevertheless, he does attribute a lot to animals. So the body is doing a lot of work in Descartes' philosophy, more work than you might think. So he says, even without minds, even without sort of souls, animals still remember, imagine, have sensory perceptions, and all of these. They have all of those sorts of faculties, which you might think seem like mental faculties. But anyway, not to get too much into that. I suppose a sentient machine, a kind of, Descartes would say maybe a sort of automaton. For him, it wouldn't be possible for a machine, a sort of purely physical machine, so something that we have built, presumably, it wouldn't be possible for that machine to think like we do, because they don't have a soul or a mind. So that's the short answer, I suppose. That for Descartes, it just wouldn't be the idea that you could sort of create out of something physical a minded being, is impossible for him. So yeah.
And then just a couple more questions then, and then we can wrap things up. Sure. Or this one might not be so much of a question, it's just someone saying Descartes is really interesting to compare with Locke, not only because they're so similar in their initial premises, but because they come to such radically different conclusions. And they also said, like when you were talking about the sun and stuff, it's funny because Plato uses similar kind of analogies with his forms and stuff. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, or
so similarities between Descartes and Plato, definitely. One of the things, I don't know if I said this, but one of the things that struck me actually about Plato and Descartes when I first came across these philosophers, when I started out doing philosophy, is this idea that they both have, that there's this kind of conceptual world that is just irreducible. It can't be boiled down to purely physical stuff. And that, I think, is the pull for me. That just, I mean, when I first read it, I was a first year undergraduate student, and when I first read it, that was the thing that made sense to me. That there was this world of concepts that just existed above, and that couldn't just be boiled down to sort of electrical firings in the brain or something like that. It just seemed to me that was that had a sort of massive pull as being sort of something truthful in that. So definitely lots of similarities between Plato and Descartes in that respect. Locke. So I don't know all that much about Locke, so I'm not going to say anything too much. But yes, there are some similarities, I suppose, but also some key differences between Locke's philosophy and Descartes' philosophy.
Yeah.
So one of them being, Locke's denial that we have any innate ideas. That would be a big one. So for Locke, the mind is a blank slate before we experience the world through our senses, and that's where we kind of get our ideas from, through this sort of sensory awareness, and also our sort of reflection, the sort of workings of our own mind, but it's all experience. So our ideas come to us through this experience. For Descartes, that's just not at all true, that there are ideas that we can have, that we can possess, that we can reflect on with no sensory experience whatsoever. Our mind isn't blank for Descartes. Our mind is sort of rich. We just have to sort of reflect and discover the things that are in our own minds for him. So that would be one key difference between those two thinkers.
And another question someone's asked, that it might be a bit too broad to kind of quickly answer, but they've said, how did people before Descartes think of the mind-body problem? So maybe if you want to go into maybe just one or two of the primary kind of different philosophies out there, because it can't give a whole exposition of the history of philosophy and what everyone's thought.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So yeah, it's okay. That's an interesting one. I guess. Well, for Aristotle, we can talk briefly about Aristotle, because I suppose it's someone that Descartes would have been, very familiar with the ideas of Aristotle, since it was the kind of bread and butter for, as we said, at that time. So for Aristotle, and I'm not really going to talk with all that much authority on this, but the soul is the kind of form of the body. So he has this idea of these the forms. It's sort of the animation of the body, and so it's less of a, well, it's not really a kind of mind-body distinction. We do have, we have these rational capacities, of course, but it's not. We don't have the same sort of problem as the problem that we see in Descartes, with these sort of two entirely distinct substances that then we have to explain sort of how they interact. I guess, I suppose the idea of a soul, actually, John Cottingham has a great book that's out at the moment, that I'm writing a review of at the moment, called In Search of the Soul, which is it's a lovely little book. It's really really well written, and really just a lovely thing to read. And that book traces the kind of concept of the soul through the kind of history of philosophy, talks about all the ways in which we think of what the soul is, whether we think of it like Descartes as kind of mind, as kind of self-mind, the kind of religious significance of the soul, and also a poetic significance of the soul as well, actually. So the idea that if you describe an event in your life as your soul soaring, that has a kind of really profound meaning. It's not just a kind of feeling of joy. It's something that encompasses your entire self. So there's this kind of, he talks about the kind of idea. So we do have that idea, and obviously that's a kind of idea with religious significance. So that was existing for as long as ever, for a very long time. The idea that there's something that's a soul and something that's a body. So I suppose in that sense the problem has existed. But in terms of other philosophers, I mean, each of them have their own sort of little idiosyncratic positions on this kind of thing. Yeah, I suppose for Plato, well, while we're just talking about him,
yeah, sure.
We have this idea of the rational soul wanting to escape the body entirely. So Plato wants to get rid of all the kind of bodily urges of the passions and appetites, sexual appetites for food and things like that, that they're all just distracting from our proper purpose, which is to sort of think. And that there's this real sense in Plato that he wants us to break free of the kind of influence of our bodies. I don't know that that's as true for Descartes. I mean, there are bits that perhaps you might read like that. Certainly in kind of when he starts in the beginning of the Meditations, wanting to lead us away from the senses, wanting to kind of, no, you need to reflect on your ideas. We're doing some intellectual thinking. We need to sort of, not think about how hungry we are right now or what we can see or feel right now. So there's a sense in which, to do our intellectual thinking, we do need to sort of detach from the body to a certain extent. But for Descartes, the two are incredibly intimately linked. And of course, he recognizes the brain and the brain's significance in our thinking as well. He says that the brain is the seat of the soul. So so he has a sort of slightly more unified picture of the human being, I think.
Awesome. Yeah. So the last question I'll ask then is one from one of my subscribers who's going to study philosophy next year. And whenever
Great.
I have someone on who has kind of been down that road, he always asks what advice you would give to someone who's wanting to study philosophy. And I guess he's not sure at the moment, but he's thinking maybe this is something he'd like to pursue beyond degree as well. So.
Okay. I mean, I'm biased, I'm sure, but I think everybody should study philosophy. So it's quite easy to think of reasons or advice. I think I would say read primary texts. So make sure in your studies that you're starting as much as possible with the kind of you're seeing things at the source. So before you read a billion things on Descartes, just spend a few days and read the Meditations through. The Meditations is great, easy to access. A lot of the early modern texts are not kind of impenetrable, I think, the kind of texts from this period. So Descartes and Hume and Locke and Berkeley and these sorts of thinkers. Also, Plato's dialogues are really fantastic, and they're a great place to start with philosophy. I think they're just really fun to read as well, and easily digestible. So I think that would be the kind of advice. Yeah, make sure you read the primary texts.
And someone's just added on to the end of that question, which might follow on nicely. What is one philosophy book you would suggest beginners start out with?
Oh, I think I have to say the Meditations.
Okay. Yeah.
I read the Meditations in a class that I had when I was a first year undergraduate that was called Philosophical Texts, and all it was just it involved reading through the Meditations and talking about a section each week. And I, speaking from experience, I found it really lovely to read, and it gives you a kind of it really leads you through quite sort of relatively gently through these kind of big ideas, big philosophical ideas. And it's short and sweet. Maybe you can do the thing, do one a day and then rest on the 7th.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on to talk about this stuff with me. Is there anything that you're doing that you want to share with people, or if they want to contact you, anything?
Well, you can find me on Twitter. I tweet a lot about Descartes. So if you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Lauren AM Slater. So yeah, if you want to get in touch, then that's probably a good way to do it.
Awesome. So I will end the stream there then. The stream's like a few seconds behind, so I just wait 5 seconds.
Okey-doke.